I am fortunate to have followed the presentations of my classmates because all of the development challenges that they've discussed pretty much tie into the region that I'm going to speak about today. The Sahel is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. It's one of the least developed regions, and it houses some of the world's most vulnerable people. So the Sahel is home to 150 million people, depending on how you define the region. It's defined typically as an eco-climatic region that covers basically from one coast of Africa to the other. For the purposes of the UN, who's the focus of my presentation, it's about 9 countries. So those countries are primarily in the Western Sahel. And so of those 150 million people, 23 million of them in the year 2016 are at risk of food insecurity. 1 in 6, so that's 1 in 6 people. 1 in 25 need urgent food assistance. 1 in 5 children are currently malnourished, and then 4.5 million people are displaced by conflicts. So that just gives you just a brief synopsis of what's going on in the region. So there's conflict, there's climate risk, there's poor health, there's actual starvation, there's food insecurity. Again, there's every development challenge you can imagine. And so when I think of all the challenges being faced by the region, I think about who's often the most vulnerable. Of the most vulnerable people, it's always women and girls. And so you look at these little girls, and on average they'll have 1.4 years of education. So they'll go to school for 1 year their entire life. The majority of them will be married by 14 years old, and over the course of their life, this is a statistic for Niger, they'll have 7.6 children. So that 7.6 children is the number we're going to focus on today. And we're not focusing on it because in and of itself it's a problem. If we don't have 7.6 children, that's fine. But the fact is that the women there don't want to have that many children. So there's a disconnect between sort of their reproductive path and the path that they envision for themselves. And that number prevents them from being able to participate fully in economics and social life, and it prevents the region from progressing in the way that it could. Of those women, 100,000 will die during childbearing. Of those women, 600,000 will give birth to children who will die within the first year of life, within the first month of life, excuse me. And of those women, 18 million have an unmet need for family planning. So within the next 2 years, they don't want to have more children, or they want to limit the number of children they have, or they want to space the children. And we can talk about all the reasons why they have this unmet need and why there are so many barriers to their reproductive health. You can talk about the social barriers, the cultural barriers, the religious barriers, the economic barriers, the lack of health infrastructure in the region. But the important point is that there are 18 million women who want to be able to improve their health, but they can't because for some reason they can't access contraception. So what is the impact of this? When we're thinking about why family planning, why fertility is so important to the region, we think about the implications for the larger development challenges that the region is facing, those very same challenges that I opened the presentation with. So in the Sahel, and we're focusing on just a few countries here, but the picture is pretty much the same across the 9 countries. You'll see in a 35-year span, a doubling of the population, a tripling of the population, a doubling of the population. And when you're talking about such a vulnerable region, those population pressures cannot be absorbed by the current economic systems and by the social support system. And furthermore, they can't be absorbed by our current levels of development aid. So the more people in the region, the more migration you'll see, the more conflict you'll see, the more food insecurity you'll see. And as they've discussed, it's a feedback loop between these climate impacts that the region is facing. So what can we do about it? I am a strong believer in institutional level change. I think you all know that. I spent my practicum working at USAID, and I think that a lot of the interventions, when you talk about developing toolkits and when you talk about introducing new frameworks, you have to think about who's going to read them, who is being impacted, and how that is actually bringing about change. And so for my project, I wanted to work on an advocacy project that really looks at who our partners are in this fight to provide family planning and to meet the unmet need, and really targeting an organization that I think is doing the right work in the right ways. And so the UC Berkeley Oasis Initiative is an initiative that focuses on these challenges in the Sahel, and it works to empower and educate adolescent girls, which they believe is one of the pillars of development for the region. It works to expand access to voluntary family planning and to adapt cultural practices to climate change. These are all necessary components of development challenges in the Sahel. So for my aspect of the Advocacy Project, I am working on expanding access to voluntary planning. So the majority of what I was doing with the Oasis Initiative was just developing a strategy. So who is it that we need to target in order to make family planning at the forefront of our development and humanitarian assistance in the Sahel? And there's already a number of partners who are working in this area, and George challenged me to think about the information is already there, we know the importance of the issue, but what is it that needs to change, and who needs to hear the right messages for us to make this a development priority and a humanitarian relief priority? So we looked at all the institutions that are working on addressing the issue of family planning, and we looked at UN OCHA, which is the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance. And when they discuss providing women's health to the region, and like I said, it's 23 million people at risk for all of these issues, they only talk about providing emergency services for pregnant women. And that is not family planning. You wouldn't have to provide emergency services oftentimes if you allowed women to control their reproduction, right? So we identified OCHA as a partner who is already working to address the issue, but not fully addressing it in the way that we see as a priority. And so we figured out how should they be addressing it, what is the message that they need to hear in order to understand what an issue it is, and then what are internal allies within the organization that we can target. And so we looked at the humanitarian response coordinator for the Sahel, which we literally got his name out of the Sahel humanitarian response plan, and developed basically a letter writing campaign. We identified advocates that are already working with the Oasis Initiative who know this individual and who can help us participate in the next iteration of the humanitarian response plan so that we can motivate and encourage the 110 partners who have worked on this plan to include family planning, to budget for family planning, and to also see it as a priority. And the conclusion that we drew is that right now there's a call for an additional $2 billion to support because the scope of funding needed to support the Sahel is much larger, but there is a call for an additional $2 billion in the next 2 years to support the region. Of that $2 billion, I think $233 million should be allotted to family planning because it's the amount to meet the unmet need.
Questions?
Davey.
Yeah. Why aren't they prioritizing this already? What's their main reason?
So there are a few different reasons, and one which I think Professor Fox can speak to a lot is that there is this sort of misconception about the demographic dividend and what such rapid population growth could do for development in the region. So when you talk about issues of fertility and high fertility, for some population experts, they believe that there's going to be a youth bulge, which creates a surplus of employment opportunities and productivity, and so that the rise in population growth is a good thing. But unfortunately, because the framework is not set to support that growth, it's actually not a good thing. So when you talk to some of these advocates, they're like, no, we don't need to worry about the population issue because it's going to be a benefit to these communities. Wow, that's my reason.
And we found that, at least with USAID, that religious institutions can be hindrance to the effective implementation. I mean, you didn't mention it, but I think it's not.
Oh, of course it's there. Of course it's there. And that's not to say that that there's already, family planning is supported in the region already, and there's a big push by, the government of Niger has a strict family planning program and there's Family Planning 2020, and all of these countries that are represented in the 9 OCHA countries also have their own plans for family planning, and we're just saying that there's not enough funding at this point, and that and the UNDP, which is also part of the UN, has its own plan for funding for the Sahel, which is such a small amount.
But the constraints on funding aren't due to religious objections in Washington.
No, I wouldn't say so. No, not entirely.
This is a fantastic topic. But what if you say that you want to get $1 billion, what would be the number one priority, number 1, 2, 3 priority? Because I think that, like with Malcolm, I worked with him for weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I never felt that he had a priority that was really clear that he can, that he can really say, okay, this amount of money.
Where would we allocate that money in terms of growth? Yeah. So a lot of my personal belief about where the money should be allocated from comes from the Boot Marker Institute and what they believe about sort of where family planning needs to be strengthened in the region. If you ask Malcolm, his is just a steady flow and push of contraceptive commodities into the region. I think part of it is building the infrastructure, part of it is building the communications infrastructure. My job is working in behavior change communications, and I think a lot of what needs to change is the access to family planning, really, and access means health infrastructure first, because I think that's really lacking, and providing social franchising models in the region. I think there's a lot that you could do with the money, and I don't think it's necessarily just a push of commodities, but even like you see in other regions, even a push of commodities, people uptake family planning, so that's fine with me.
I'm just wondering, since you're into behavior change, I thought your graphics are beautiful and the slides are beautiful, but I'm wondering, what about the men?
Yeah.
Because, fathers are the parent, one of the two parents that decide to marry the girls, at 14 or under, and men who may have several wives may set them up in competition to have more kids. There are like cultural norms around that supply of contraceptives doesn't really address.
Right. I think first and foremost, what we're talking about is not total demand for family planning. So one thing, we're talking strictly about unmet needs. So these are the women, if they had access, they would use contraception. And one of the things that a report from the Gates Foundation discussed is that a lot of the women in these regions, they want injections, because to some degree that
their men don't know.
So their men don't know. So that helps to get around, So that helps to get around the issue of, my husband does, and then I don't have to explain away why I'm not having children, and it's completely my choice. And the problem with the provisions that are being provided by the UNDP is it's still pills and it's still condoms, and it's not the actual mid and long-term methods that women are requesting. And so that's also a part of, my own advocacy is advocating for the introduction of more long-term contraceptive methods to the region. And again, people are saying, well, because of these issues you're discussing, no, women won't use them because they only, in the short term, they don't want to have kids. But really, this is a longer term issue, and they would be willing to use these mid and long term methods if they had access. And that's been proven.
All right, thank you.